Welcome to the Science and Cooking public lecture series. My name is Pia, and I'm soon going to introduce Lars Williams. The way we usually do this is I give a little bit of an introduction about the sort of science of the week. And in parallel with this lecture series, there is a class for undergrads, which happens tomorrow. And if you were an undergrad in the class, then this week would be, the entire week would be cooking with microbes, which we all know, because something as simple as this, most of us, many of you have had something cooked with microbes today: coffee, chocolate, maybe bread. This here is essentially just a piece of bread slowly rising. And as this is happening, the microbes are converting the sugar into carbon dioxide, the gas that's being captured in the bread matrix, and a little bit of ethanol. Okay, so what is a microbe? What is a microbe? A microbe basically, first of all, is very, 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 very small. If I take my hair and I just look across it, I can fit like 10 or 100 microbes just across it. That's how tiny they are. This is a pin, and it's been colored, obviously. And all the little yellow dots are basically E. coli. And this is how tiny they are. The other thing that is interesting about microbes is that they are basically bags of enzymes. So the thing that makes them so amazing is if here you have some little yeast. This is what the yeast cell looked like. And for so long before what we knew that microbes even existed, we thought of fermentation as it being something magical. But the magic is really just all of the stuff that happens inside the cell. And so we can see what's being taken up, right? We can see that glucose is being taken up, and we can see what is being put out. We can see that ethanol and carbon dioxide are being put out. And everything in between is just a magical mess. But that magical mess is produced by enzymes. And this is true for something like the bread. It's also true for mold fermentations. So mold fermentations are special because unlike something like yeast, which is just a very, very small cell, they have these beautiful hyphae. So this video here, let's hope this one works. This video here is barley grains that have been inoculated with Aspergillus oryzae. And you can see how it slowly, slowly grows, takes over the barley, produces these hyphae, these beautiful little things, and it's kind of enveloping the barley grains. And as they do this, this thing here happens. So what is different between a yeast fermentation and a mold fermentation is that molds have the superpower of basically making enzymes and then putting them out in their surroundings. So as opposed to having them inside the cell, they are making enzymes, putting them out, and outside of the cell, they do all kinds of things. So these are the amylases, the proteases, the lipases. They're being sent out. They're breaking down the long carbohydrates. They're breaking down the long fats, the big proteins, into tiny, tiny, tiny molecules. And what do we know about tiny molecules? They float in the air. Yes, say more?
They can fit on the head of a pin.
They can fit on the head of a pin, even more than the microbes, yes. What else? What do we know about when big molecules are being broken down into tiny molecules? Yes, in the back.
They're easier to digest.
They're easier to digest, and what else? They're less complex. They also fit more easily on your taste buds and on your olfactory receptors. And so you're basically making flavor as all of this happens. And this here is basically what those enzymes do. So none of those reactions would happen on their own, right? If you have some flour sitting in a bowl, it's just going to sit there. It's not going to break down long molecules into tiny, tiny molecules. But what the enzymes do is they speed it up. And so what this graph here shows is that if you have these long, big molecules, and you want them to become tiny little molecules, little flavor molecules, little sugar molecules, then there's going to be some activation barrier. There's going to be some energy that needs to be put in for these bonds to break. And what the enzymes do is they make it happen more easily. So I've summarized this in an equation. And if you're new to this lecture series, you know that we clap for equations. And if you don't like equations, forget about it. I'm going to introduce Lars soon. But if you like equations, then this is basically what it says. So you have some reaction. And it happens kind of at a constant rate. So that's your K0. And then you have an exponential, and then you have two parts here. You have this delta E, which is the activation barrier. That's how much energy you need to put in. And then you have kBt, which is basically the thermal energy. So if molecules are moving around a lot, then T is big and this is big. And then your rate ends up being faster of the reaction as it happens. And if you have a lower activation barrier, then your K is also faster. And that's how this equation works. And this is how enzymes work. Whether they're inside a cell or whether they're outside a cell, this is basically the equation that explains how they work. OK, so enough with equations. I'm going to introduce Lars. And all of this is going to make sense. So the first time I met Lars, I haven't checked with you if I can tell the story. The first time I met Lars was on a boat just outside Noma in Copenhagen, which was the R&D facility, the research and development boat for Noma. And he very generously invited me in to take a look, and he showed me all the stuff they do. And then he said, here's a honeycomb. Let me give you a little honeybee larva. Do you remember this? Yeah, he remembers. He was like, here. And he pulled out a little honeybee larva, and it was wiggling. And he was like, here, try it. Do you remember if I tried it or not?
I think you tried it.
He's so good. He thinks I tried it. OK, the most recent time I met Lars was many years later, down the road from Noma, still in Copenhagen, around the corner from Alchemist, for those of you who know it. Totally different scenario. This time I was being given various little cups with things, with delicious flavors. And has anyone been to Copenhagen and sort of enjoyed the food there? So then you know that you spend a few times there, a few days there, and it's very hard to kind of be blown away. It's one of the food capitals in the world. After you've eaten a few times there, it's very hard to be blown away by flavor combinations. Lars did that. There were all these little cups and thingies, and he was like, here's this. And I tried, and all of these flavors just spoke out in this beautiful, beautiful symphony. And that was when I thought, I'm going to invite him to Harvard. So here we are. And I'm just going to hand over to Lars. Please join me in welcoming him. And over to you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. You hopefully all have little cups, and maybe there's still something in the cups. But if not, please go ahead and find out what it is. It's a cilantro spirit that we make. And I just feel often with flavor, tasting is what you have to do to really have an understanding. And hopefully what we're going to talk about is how we wound up sitting here in a room having a cilantro-flavored spirit, which is a little tangential to most spirits. I've been cooking for most of my life, the last stint in a restaurant in Copenhagen with a reputation for being hyper-regional. That wasn't the success of the restaurant. Regionality wasn't something that put us in a pedestal, or a declaration of Nordic products didn't make us holy in any way. It was rather a tool that we wielded, something that we used to carve away extraneous ideas, sort of trim the fat from the bone, so to speak. Oops. We often used ingredients that we found and foraged, and as Pia was talking about, insects became something we were fascinated with. These are ants from the Formica family, so they produce formic acid, which is like this lovely, almost Meyer lemon kind of acidity that's really beautiful, we love to use. Sorry. But in general, we were using Nordic products, so langoustines from the Faroe Islands, Norwegian scallops from above the Arctic Circle, blueberries from Sweden, meat from Greenland. But a lot of people kind of got focused on that hyper-regionality and were missing the point. At one point, this German newspaper was going to break a story about Noma, and it was going to be this big scandal that we were actually using German onions, and it wasn't a Nordic product. And we kind of like laughed in the restaurant because they were missing the entire point, that we weren't creating a regional restaurant. What was regional about what we were doing was the lens that we were seeing the world with. We were creating a way of looking at the world that was the regional product that we were developing. And that lens allows us to kind of create that experience, whether we were in Tokyo, in Sydney, in Mexico, and be able to kind of bring our lens with us wherever we went. A region dictates a million different choices that will be impressed upon you. And once you can shed the detritus of generations of choices that have gone before you, it becomes possible to forge something unique. And so in terms of how you move on from the obvious, and the questions become, why are you doing it? The why. Are you doing something just because that's the way that someone did it before you? Or is it actually the best way that you can do it? And part of that is perfection. I don't believe in perfection, but I believe in chasing it every day, that something can never be good enough, that there's always a way to make things better. I can't come up with a recipe, dust my hands off, and say that's the best I can do. Every product that we make is iterative. So this bottle of Ayuk doesn't taste the same as a product that we make 2 years ago. In my opinion, it tastes better because we're constantly trying to improve. And that's something that I found really impressive when I was in Japan, that you have, let's say, a miso maker who's a 16th generation miso maker. And in a sense, he's making miso, but he's doing it differently than his father did, than his grandfather did, because each time they make it, they're trying to just tweak it ever so slightly. And it's not, I think, a more Western approach of coming up with, not to offend anyone, I grew up on Jameson's, but an Irish whiskey, and they come up with a recipe, and it's going to be that same recipe for the next 200 years. It's a very different way of approaching things. I have great respect and love for the traditional way of doing things, but the way that my brain's wired, it just goes into overdrive trying to figure out how to do it better. Rules are meant to be broken, and because they're often inane and set up by a particular group of people who happen to be in a position of power at a particular time. When we realize our spirits, well, we couldn't categorize them. In my head, this is sort of between like an Isla whiskey and a mezcal. These two products are completely different. I don't know where Doritos sits on the normal spectrum of categories, but it's not a gin and it's not a whiskey. Once we discovered that, or felt, or were told that we couldn't be in categories, is actually very liberating. And that gave us even more kind of creative freedom to just pursue flavor and follow like flavor as a North Star. But why do we actually care about flavor? In my opinion, it's because it allows you to sort of interact with people in a very different way than almost any other sort of sensory form. Flavor has the special capacity to trigger memories, especially emotionally charged memories, because of the direct connections olfaction have with parts of the limbic system involved in generating emotion and memory. Olfaction is unique in the sensory system because it projects directly to the amygdala without being gated by the thalamus, and thus creates flavor memories that are directly accessed, not constitutionally recreated by the brain, as most of our sort of memories do with touch, sight, sound. None of our other senses have as little as targeted connections with areas of the brain that process emotion, associative learning, and memory. For me, I think the moment that kind of clarified this personally was the first time that my mother came to eat a noma, and I had developed this dish, this oyster dish. I put the plate down in front of her, and we have an open kitchen, so you sort of drop plates, and then you walk back to the kitchen, and if it's your mom sitting at the restaurant, you're then anxiously waiting and watching her while she's eating. And my mom took a bite, and she kind of paused, and then just sat there, like not doing anything for like 5 minutes, and went down to kind of check on her. And I was like, Mom, what's going on? She's like, this dish of a very weird Danish oyster that she'd never had before, with a bunch of wild herbs that she'd never had before, and a bunch of very strange fermented things that I made that she'd never had before, had brought her back to being a kid in Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, like this, and she was having that experience. And so that's what it kind of like clarified or crystallized in my mind, this sense that you can kind of use flavors to elicit sense memories, but you can also use them to communicate sense memories. And that became something that I became, as my sort of tenure at NOMA progressed, like more and more passionate about following. And I think I was very lucky to be in a place like NOMA with the kind of people that were very passionate about what we're doing. And this is Dr. J, who I think has graced these halls before. She's a flavor scientist that I worked with on the boat. This is actually a shot from the boat that Pia was talking about. And here, Ariel is holding up flavor compounds that are generated by ants. So this is how we actually became friends, because she's got a terrible habit of peering over people's shoulders while they're working on the computer. And I had just kind of dipping my toe or my hand into the ant world and was really excited about the different flavors that were created. So I was trolling different patent papers and scientific articles, and there's a paper that was showing up a bunch of compounds that ants use for communication. And Ariel looked over my shoulder and said, "Oh, what are you looking at lemongrass for?" And I was like, "Oh, stupid intern, like that's how ants signal that there's a food microbe over there." And she's like, "No, that's a chemical that's lemongrass." Because Ariel's got her PhD in flavor chemistry, and so knows what a lemongrass molecule looks like. And I said, "Well, what's that one?" She said, "Oh, leather." I was like, "What's that one?" "Mint." And so it realized that like ants were actually communicating in flavor, and then you can actually be using different types of ants to get like kind of a mint flavor if you're looking at it. One of the line cooks at NOMA described it as like a mint condom, which I couldn't verify personally, but there we were. But epiphanies like this, like the flavor of ants, slowly shaped into something like an earwig, like an earworm that kind of got me passionate about delving into what other things were in this world of edible and non-edible, right? What defines edible? In my opinion, deliciousness defines edible. Some people will say that ants aren't edible. They're actually very delicious. If you go to Zimbabwe, they eat these kind of mufume worms, which I don't think are delicious. But if you eat an ant in front of them, they will think you're like an insane person and would never try an ant. So like these cultural bounds that we find defining what we consider edible or inedible, in my opinion, it's really deliciousness is one of those key factors. In the same way that the really delicious mold that Pia was showing earlier, if that's something that you found in the back of your fridge, you would probably bin it or throw it out quite quickly. Yet, it's this lovely, that we actually use barley koji in our process, but koji is what gives sake its flavor. That is what generates these lovely, sweet floral tones that we kind of recognize as the sake flavor. So that mold and what we kind of think of as something that looks potentially horrendous transforms and is actually something quite delicious. So there I was at the end of 2016, having been the head of R&D at Noma for 8 years at that point, and we were designing the new restaurant. And it was kind of feeling like an inflection point that I was either going to sign up for another 8-year tour or kind of do something on my own. And I was considering my options and doing what I normally do to clear my head. I walked out into the forest where we go foraging for ants, among other things, but also pine. And this is the forest where we get both pine and ants. And it was this kind of early spring, so quite cold, but the sun was out uncharacteristically in Copenhagen, and it was like this beautiful, crisp moment that was like kind of, for me, encapsulated a lot of like the really wonderful part of the countryside around Copenhagen. And my sister, who had just had 2 young girls, hadn't been able to travel with me for quite a while, and I was just really wanting to somehow like capture this moment and be able to share it with her. And that kind of idea just got in my head a little bit, and like, how could we take these sense memories that we were creating in the restaurant, and how could we make them more shareable? How can we make it more democratic in a way? So I got it in my head about trying to put all these different flavors into a bottle. In this case, like, could it be, I mean, how do you take the time and skill, blood and tears that you've put it, to try and put something together for 40 people for this sort of ephemeral, evanescent moment, which is what dining in a restaurant is. And it's very theatrical, and that's what makes it a very beautiful moment, because it's something that can only happen in that one time and place, and it's kind of gone in the way that listening to a beautiful concert is gone. But how can you actually put that into a bottle and be able to blow it into someone's window and have them have that same experience? And also to sort of democratize the process of what we were able to do in Noma and make it more shareable. So in the sense, and so the very first spirit we actually did was a pine and forest moss spirit, because I had in my head of wanting to kind of create and share that experience with my sister. And so thinking about what to do, and obviously putting things into a bottle, you start thinking about booze, or at least I do. I guess that's maybe why I have a problem. But alcohol is actually like an ideal substrate for capturing flavors. Since it has 2 carbon atoms, it has amphiphilic properties with a hydrophobic moiety derived from alkaline ethene and polar hydroxyl group. Importantly, the hydroxyl group contains a hydrogen atom that's bonded to a highly electronegative element of oxygen. That just means it's sticky, basically. It loves to stick to other organic compounds, like smells, aromas, flavors. And then, but because you're typically always having a mixture with water, the amount that you can then pull flavor from in a maceration, you can actually slide the scale. So some things like to be macerated and distilled at very high ABVs, so something like 70% alcohol. Some of them like to be done at 15% alcohol. And Some things like to be pulled from vinegars, some things like to be pulled from fats, and we're able to kind of harness all those and then translate them back into an alcohol, which also happily is a preservative as well. So for a lot of these organic compounds, it seemed to make sense in the ways of sharing sense memories and dreams. But then once we have the basic elements of, let's say, the idea of a cilantro, how do we assemble these flavors into a concept or a memory? I tend to think of it, because I went to school for literature, and much to my surprise, there wasn't a bevy of jobs waiting for me with a literature degree. But I tend to think of flavor in like a narrative arc. So you have like an inception point, an inciting incident, something happens, conflict, reaction, a midpoint, and then finally a resolution. And for me, when we're developing flavors, whether it's in a dish in a restaurant or a sauce or an alcohol, we think of that sort of narrative arc and trying to have both like a full continuum of flavor and this sort of arc of flavor, but also sort of high points along that flavor journey to kind of keep you stimulated, even during like a single sip. And that the kind of constant stimulation and like sort of the way of juxtaposing or creating sense memories for me is also having something that's unexpected. And I think so, whether it's a bee larva that you're trying for the very first time, that is actually very creamy, very like almost like a dulce leche if you didn't know it was like a bee larva. So there's something that's very familiar about the taste, but also something that's obviously quite novel about it. And we go about doing the same things every day, and it's only when something's different do you actually notice it. So we automatically execute most of our everyday monotonous acts, opening doors, buttoning shirts, without any explicit realization of learned movements, and that's memory involved. Unless something is amiss, the door sticks, the button's missing. With flavor, the same is true. People generally just consume without much awareness of how ingrained their likes and dislikes, unless there's a nudge, a shudder in their everyday. So the best way to trigger an direct emotional response is to juxtapose the implicitly familiar with the novel. So orchestrating some novel combination, but somehow evoking a delighted childhood memory. Often these seem to be universal: walking through the forest, having surf wash up between your toes, a baby tasting ice cream for the first time. And then if one can generate fluctuations in the flavor, so that has length, depth, and breadth punctuated by peaks along the narrative arc, in my mind, that's what I am trying to achieve in creating a successful flavor. So, but how do you connect that to booze? When I began teaching myself about distilling, there was a lot of things I didn't really understand, as in food, as in the hot dog picture. Or that didn't seem honest to the way that I wanted to work and had been working during my career as a chef, and felt antiquated and almost like in a parody of itself compared to what was happening in, I think, brewing and winemaking and restaurants in the culinary field. Why did the vast majority of distilleries buy in factory-produced ethanol? I mean, you can imagine going to a fine dining restaurant and getting a TV dinner with a sprig of tarragon on it and saying, voila. I mean, for the few distilleries that actually brew their own alcohol, like, why don't they talk about the complexity, the integrity, the sort of foundation of flavors the way that brewers or winemakers do? It was something that I'd never heard in any of the discussions. Often it was just like, oh, this is my great-grandfather's gin recipe that we found in like an old trunk or whatever it was, you know? Why don't whiskey distilleries sell more of their fresh spirits instead of very aged whiskey? Is it because it's undrinkable? I mean, why even have the undrinkable thing to begin with? Why aren't there vintages in alcohol in the same way that there's vintages in wine? I mean, we have a kind of dating system on all our bottles, which actually shows the vintages, and I think that's something we're proud of in terms of like the iteration and kind of progress and innovation that we try and apply to our products. Why do all the stills look like they looked exactly 400 years ago? Surely there's other things that have improved in 400 years, so the stills aren't one of them. So I came up with this idea of doing a vacuum distillation. And this is the very first proof of concept that we did, which is literally a pressure cooker that I chopped up into bits, welded together with a bunch of condensers and a column, and had a chest freezer that was basically had 4 car radiators in it, and then we were circulating glycol through the car radiators inside of the chest freezer, and a very, very, very loud vacuum pump. But as a proof of concept, it didn't blow up, didn't implode either, but it was something that I knew that I wanted to be able to use flavors in the same way that I use flavors in the kitchen. So normally in a distillation, the distillation is happening around 190, 195 degrees Fahrenheit, which, if you can imagine putting cilantro into a pot for 12 hours at 190 degrees, you'll probably get the world's worst vegetable soup. But I wanted to be able to get that freshness, so how do we do that? We need to be able to distill at low temperatures. So basically, this is kind of the extrapolation of idea of a rotary evaporator, if anyone's used a rotary evaporator before, but it's a scientific tool for basically, typically they're throwing away what you're distilling off because it's a solvent and you're retaining something that would start off in the product flask. We sort of keep the distillate part of things instead. But the idea was to then try and extrapolate that process into something that would be more a production-sized piece of equipment. So this is the first piece of equipment that was like a production size. This is a 150-liter still, so around 40 gallons. And we can basically do, instead of 190, 195 degrees Fahrenheit, we can distill. Well, we typically do the distillations from 65 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which allows us to keep things in like a very, shall I say, unmolested state or a very fresh state. So we can take habaneros and distill habaneros and have like the fresh habanero flavor, or cilantro, or I mean pepperoni, but pepperoni is usually cooked anyway. That does a couple different things. One allows us to use those products in a very fresh state. The other is that because it's a closed system, the most volatile compounds, the smells, the aromas, instead of being off-gas into the atmosphere like a normal still was, distillers typically call it cleaning or cleaning a spirit. Anything that's all the smells and aromas actually get pushed back into our spirit because it's a closed system. So the bouquet and aroma of our spirits is, I think, very different than what is often had. In that sense, it's kind of like, I guess like if you're making chicken stock or chicken soup at home, and that's, for me, what makes a house a home, that lovely smell of like roast chicken kind of infusing a home. One way to, if you're thinking cynically about it, is that all that beautiful aroma is actually lost flavor. And if you could actually take that aroma and shove it back into that chicken stock, you would have that much more flavor. So that's kind of what we're doing with this process. And one of the other things that we do a little bit differently is then things get eventually bigger. One of the other things that we do a little bit differently is the amount of cuts or fractions that's taken during the distillation. So typically a distiller will do 4 cuts or fractions. That's separating the liquid as it comes out of the still. You have the 4 shots, which is the hillbilly, make you go blind, methanol, and other nasty alcohols. You have the 4 shots, which can be high in flavor, but often tend to be rough in a sense, because it also contains some of the lighter contaminants in a way. And then you have the hearts, which is the bulk or 90% of what you're putting into a bottle, and then the tails, which is the more aqueous, sort of lower proof left behind. Some mezcal, or a lot of mezcal distillers would go quite deep into the heads, and some whiskey guy, which is why mezcal can be a little like delicious, but also kind of punchy. And then whiskey guys will go sometimes a little into the tails because there is a roundness there, but again, because you're pulling, you get a lot of the heavier compounds, which will be left in like a wash. So that can also be that bit of the hangover. We take, instead of those 4, we take between 100 to 150, depending on the size of the distillation. The reason for doing that is because I just basically, well, as a cook, I taste everything. It's a really bad habit, especially if you're out with your family in a park and there's ants around. But so when we were first distilling, I was kind of constantly tasting the liquid that was coming out of the still, and I was noticing that it tasted quite different. So you taste it 4 times, and you say, okay, those are all different. Let's extrapolate that. 16, 20, 48, 50. And around between 100 and 150, we stopped seeing like a real difference between, or a noticeable difference between cut 1 and 2. But something like a habanero, or let's say a strawberry. In a strawberry, depending on the variety of strawberries, there's between 230 and 300 organic compounds which constitute a strawberry flavor. And each of those organic compounds has a different molecular weight, which means that on the distillation continuum, they evaporate at a different point in time. So that is to say, you start getting, in each one of those fractions, 2, 3 compounds in each one, which means that you're essentially taking something that I'd always thought of as a cook as a single flavor, strawberry flavor, habanero flavor, and exploding it into 200 pieces. And each one of those pieces has a slightly different flavor. And so when you reassemble them or blend them, we can basically blend back to whatever the perfect habanero flavor we have in our mind is. So when you're distilling a habanero, the very first, let's say 10, 15 fractions are just pure spiciness, like the real, like piquant that makes you tighten up a little bit. And then you get into red fruit, like currant, raspberries. And then there's a bit of like tropical flavor. And then a very odd set of cuts that's, again, 15 to 20 cuts, that's pure cantaloupe. And had you asked me prior to having this whether there's a cantaloupe hiding inside of a habanero, I would have called you an idiot. But there it is. And that's one of the beautiful things that allows us to kind of create and shape, almost like being able to Photoshop with the flavor itself, or turn the dials on what the flavor constitutes. So, oops, that's our habanero spirit. And at one point, we were making a oyster spirits. So we're actually shelling oysters and using them as our botanical. And I'd done a very small test in like a couple liters, and I thought it was a genius, and I loved it. And then we got the whole team together, and 10 of us spent a whole day shucking oysters for, I think, 8 or 9 hours. Macerated, distilled it, and I was like, this is terrible. I don't like any of this. Got a different variety of oysters, spent a whole day shucking them, macerated, distilled, still didn't like it. Did it a 3rd time. And at this point, my team was like, there's often, most of my production team, I think, hates me really, but so after doing that 3 times, I said, okay, we're not going to do it again. But at this point, I had 300 fractions of oyster flavor, which meant that I could actually pick and choose from those 3 different types of oysters and actually made a blend of oyster, which in my head was that perfect, slightly briny, mostly sweet, had this creamy aspect to it. And we had a beautiful oyster and gooseberry spirit. So this manipulation or working with nature to kind of produce flavors is something that we are accessing as our botanicals, but as a foundation, I was very keen to use a lot of the knowledge that I built in my culinary career. So, and most of that is fermentation. So how do you create alcohol? You have to typically ferment something. So this is the metabolic pathway of a yeast cell. And this is just like an illustration of, it's not like the Tokyo subway, but it's an illustration of all the different possibilities and variables that you can have with changing temperature. So if you stress the yeast by giving it too little sugar, too much sugar, you get different flavor compounds. Too little heat, too much heat, different flavor compounds. Is the yeast very like a purebred dog and doesn't like a Hefeweizen or a lager yeast? They're very delicate little guys. But something like a Belgian Saison's like a more wild in a sense and can handle a lot more weird things that we throw at. And the reason that we do this is, I think what Pia was sort of getting at in the beginning is that this becomes a collaboration. So you have, again, the ability to twist the dials, to shape things, to create flavors that are very unique. Because you can take the same barley water, which is what beer is, and if you have a yeast lager, you get if you lager yeast, you get lager. If you get a Hefeweizen, same exact barley water, you get 6, 10, 12 different beers from it, and all of that flavor is created by the yeast molecules. Blah, blah, blah. And part of that collaboration, I think this is Kanashichi-san. So this gentleman has won Best Katsuobushi in Japan for the past decade. Does anyone know what katsuobushi is? Would you like to describe what katsuobushi is? Okay. So katsuobushi is a bonito, so skipjack tuna loin that's smoked for 5 days at increasing levels of smoking, actually decreasing levels of smoke. It's then, so it dries in, that kind of resinous smoke part is shaved off. It's then inoculated with a aspergillus. It's Aspergillus glaucus, not orizae, which has the ability to kind of penetrate proteins in a way that orizae doesn't. And then molds for a month. It's then washed and then put back into, to basically remold, but without, so humid environment it molds, they take it, wash it, and then it dries for another 4 to 5 months. And eventually you basically get something that looks like that. So what start off as a giant bonito loin dries into something that's about like this size. So katsuobushi is like what the basis of all Japanese dashis are made of. So dashi starts off with kombu, which is kelp. You soak kombu in water, lightly cook it, take out the kombu, and then you put katsuobushi, which is shaved into these beautiful, almost like translucent wood shavings. And that's the basis of almost all, or not all, but a huge amount of Japanese cooking is based on this. My point in saying this is that this is by far the most elaborate and difficult fermentation that I've personally seen. And it's with the love and attention that this gentleman does that. He's got a playlist that he plays to his katsuobushi when it's in the fermentation room. This is that particular day's playlist. And I think that's just to illustrate that he really cares about it. And in the same way, I became passionate about koji. So koji, just very quick, you take pearl barley, soak it, steam it, inoculate it with Aspergillus orizae, and then for the next 36 hours, it needs to be in a very humid and hot environment. typically around 80% moisture and around 37 degrees Celsius, depending on the type of koji you have and flavors you're trying to get out of the koji. So again, with a low temp, something like Aspergillus oryzae, if you're having a low temperature, you can force it to create more protease if you're trying to make a more miso-style ferment, or if you're trying to create amylase, typically that's happening in the higher temperature thresholds. And depending on the strain of oryzae and how you can actually do a sharp temperature drop at the very end, and you can actually get it to produce both citric and malic acid. So there's a lot of kind of ways that you can interact with this microbe by stressing it, giving it the right amount of food, not enough amount of food, and sequencing that in the right way to get it to go through its metabolic pathway. This is actually, hilariously, Pia had the same video, which I think we both stole from David Chang's R&D group. But this is rice becoming koji, essentially. So koji is Aspergillus grown on a substrate. Typically, it's rice. We tend to use pearl barley. We found one person in all of Europe who would pearl barley for us to an appropriate pearling. So typically, when you're using it for sake, they talk about the amount of grain they've pearled. So you want to have as much starch as possible and not too much protein, because both a little bit during the Aspergillus fermentation, but predominantly in the yeast fermentation, too much protein will give you like funk flavors in a way that is not typically associated with like delicious, clean flavors. So we found a very grumpy farmer who was willing to pearl our barley to 60%, so we're polishing off 40% of the actual barley grain to get it down to the consistency that we wanted. This was our koji room in Copenhagen. That's Rekka, our koji queen, inspecting. So this would be after the first probably between 12 and 18 hours. So the koji's come onto the table, it's been inoculated, and we're doing the first kind of turning of the grains. So you have to kind of continually mix them, because the koji, or the Aspergillus, actually produces a huge amount of heat while it's going through its consumption and metabolic process. So it has to be constantly aerated. That's what it looks like when it's fully fleshed out. That's barley grains. But the whole point of this is that you can create all these very unique flavors. So you get these kind of tropical fruit flavors often with the koji. If you saute it in a pan, it's delicious. It tastes something like if you were to combine bacon and French toast together. If you toast it heavily in the oven, it becomes very chocolate-like. So all of these are created by billions of years of evolution, and we're just accessing all these different flavor compounds by playing nicely with it. And you have to be gentle, kind of give the barley what it wants. Talk nice to it, like Kenichi-san does. I think if I would thought buying roses for some of the fermentations would help them along, I would do that. But I mean, a lot of this also changed. I think one of the things that we discovered in the restaurant, and we tried to bring to Empirical as well, was the way that you kind of thought about fermentations, because very typically people think about koji making and they're saying, okay, I'm going to use this to make miso or sake or something that's typically done that, or you're going to always use yeast to make an alcoholic beverage. But if you start thinking about it as like sort of a black box or an algorithm that you're just plugging inputs into, you get all of a sudden very different change of outputs. So if you put koji into milk, you get a very, very interesting cheese. If you can actually use kombucha mothers to cure milk into basically a creme fraiche, which also has a very beautiful flavor. So once you start getting out of the idea of like having a fermentation being linked to an output, but it's just an algorithm which you can plug in, as I said before, you can really change the way that you're interacting with and creating new flavors. Like for instance, we used, in the restaurant, we used barley koji to make squid garum, and that was kind of like taking the idea of like a Roman garum, so that's a fermented fish sauce, and using the protease that the koji was produced to accelerate the breakdown of the proteins into amino acids. Mostly glutamates is what you're looking for the umami flavor. But then you start thinking about like, well, again, what happens if you put it into milk? Or what happens if you mix it into ground beef? Delicious. What happens if you mix it into grasshoppers? Even more delicious. So again, like thinking of it as like, in the same way that you have, the koji we started thinking about it the same way we think about a saute pan. Like you can put anything in the saute pan as you want. It has that effect on something. You can have that's going to transform, break down whatever you're putting into it into smaller constituent parts. And thinking about that really changes the way we interact within fermentation. Oops. Help. Sweet. Kombucha mother. Loosely at, this is one of my favorite books. I highly recommend, if you guys haven't come across this in this course, but it's a really, really good one. At Empirical, the way creatively, I would say there's typically 3 different avenues that we'll go down. One is falling in love with a botanical and just trying to express that as kind of cleanly and simply as we can. The second one would be falling in love with a process. So, for instance, in the middle of the pandemic, when we were all completely losing our minds, I got in my head that we had to dig a giant pit outside of the distillery, line it with rocks, set a fire on the rocks, throw a whole bunch of Danish sugar beets onto the rocks, cover it in dirt, and try and make a Nordic mezcal. So taking the inspiration of like a mezcal and then trying to transform it, shape it into something that becomes our own in a way. That was delicious, by the way, and I will never, ever, ever do it again. And then the third, which is why I have this book up, is like, we will generally have deep research projects going. So that can be something that we know will have like a very low sort of hit rate. Maybe you'll get one kind of beautiful thing a year out of it, but we just will have, like for instance, like an ongoing project with a company called White Labs, which has the biggest yeast library in the world. And so we'll constantly be like trying to get samples of their different yeasts and be working with them to see if there's something new that we can kind of tack on. Or the idea of fat washing. So that's the idea of taking a fat, adding alcohol to it and extracting the flavor from the fat. So let's have a fat washing product and try every animal fat that we can, every vegetable fat that we can, like mineral oils. Is that interesting? And that was actually in the case, so those 3 things are kind of like how we tend to try and find some sort of creative input. I would say the first, so that is falling in love with botanical. I'm just going to do this really quickly. Would be how we developed ayuk. So ayuk uses a chili called Pasilla mihe as a botanical. This was a little bit of a serendipitous find. My wife's a sculptor, and she was doing a residency down in Oaxaca. And I hadn't seen her for a month, and I thought that I should probably keep my marriage together, and so I went to visit her. And me being me, unfortunately for her, the most romantic thing I could think about doing was taking her to a famous food market in Oaxaca. And I came across these Pasilla mihe chilies. Pasilla chilies are pretty well known, but the Pasilla mihe is something that's like this whispered about but never seen chili in the culinary world because it's only grown by the Mixe people 10 to 12,000 feet up in the mountains. And they call it Pasia Mixe because it's only grown by those people. And the conquistadors, it's the only indigenous population that wasn't sort of conquered by the conquistadors, and the conquistadors called them the cloud people, because you can see the fields are actually above that cloud level, which you can see there. And this is around, I want to say like 9,000 feet up, so it's like kind of midway up the mountain. But this first village, this was called Altopec, and let me back up. Found these chilies in the market, fell in love with them, went and got 2 suitcases, brought them back to Copenhagen, and we came up with a recipe rather quickly. I tried to find an exporter to send me the chilies, and after 25 different samples, decided to go back to Oaxaca and try and find these beautiful chilies that I brought back in my suitcase. We found an academic that had worked with the Mixe people, and we went up into the mountains to try and actually speak to the farmers ourselves to try and get the chilies. In this first village, out of, let's say, 1,000 people that would have been farming it 50 years ago, there was only 12 people still doing it. It's because the agriculture is so strenuous. At the beginning of the season, it's too cold to plant the seeds, so they walk down the mountain about 2 hours where the ground's a little flatter, it's a little warmer, and they plant the seeds. And they come back 6 weeks later when the plants are about 8 inches tall or so. They pick up 50 pounds of the seedlings, and they walk up 2 hours, plant them on a 35-degree incline farm, walk back down the mountain, another 50 pounds of seedlings, bring them back up. And so they walk up and down the mountain for about a week or so, bringing up all the chili plants. And then at the end of 6 months, when they've invested a lot of time, effort, money, resources into this chili farm, some guy comes in a truck and gives them pesos on the dollar for their work. And these chilies were something that were really part of the Mixe culture. It's something that you see as like a red line that connects all of their cuisine. They burn the chilies during funeral rites, so it's really part of who they are as a people. And the practice of farming them was falling out of practice. So we did a handshake deal that first time I was in Altopec, and I said, get as many friends as you can. We'll buy your entire harvest. We gave them 30% of our projected harvest on a handshake deal, and then another 30% in the middle of the season to make sure that they didn't hit economic hardship during the farming, but also make sure I got my chilies. And they actually produced 50% more than they were expecting, which was, everyone's happy. So from that first year working with, that was probably about 17 people all told that we actually worked with that first year. We're now working with 73 farming families across 4 communities. And we work with those farmers directly to make sure that we have a dialogue with them in terms of helping them both, well, pay them more. So we pay them what market price in Oaxaca was, which is typically 3 times what they were getting before. And we also are working to help them. So the smoking of the chilies typically happens like this. So individual farms will have this set up on the side of the farm, and they're drying the chilies like this, which is why the spirit has this lovely kind of fruity, smoky flavor to it. But this is like a very difficult thing to be sitting inside of a smoke hut for hours and hours on time. So helping them set up community smokers, and then also bringing like an agronomist down from Mexico City to show them biodynamic techniques for pesticides and fertilizers. But all of this is a pain in the ass. And but I think that's what we decide to do when we are just following flavor and trying to go where flavor takes us. And we strive to be curious and unafraid.